As you know, I'm a former British ambassador to Bahrain and Syria, and more recently, I've been active with George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain, where I am now deputy leader.
Well, congratulations, Peter, on your new position of the deputy leader of George Galloway's party, and perhaps we can talk about that a bit more, the future prospects of your party vis-a-vis the two mainstream parties of the Labour and the Conservatives. But Peter, what we want to talk about right now is this past week of mayhem across Britain, and also recently it's come into manifest in Belfast. I don't know if you've seen the news, but there's been some severe protests or riots in Belfast, and a very horrible attack on a foreign national, I believe. Peter, as the ambassador to Bahrain and Syria, you're an expert on Middle Eastern policy. And what you've made clear to me is that there's a direct consequence of British government foreign policy in the Middle East with what's happening with all these riots over the last week. You've put it to me in this way. You've said that chickens have come home to roost. I wonder, could you just explain what you mean by that to other people, a wider audience?
Absolutely, the chickens are coming home to roost from the British government, British establishment reaction to the October happenings in Gaza and the massacres that have followed, because in unison, the main British political parties got behind Israel from the beginning and remain there to this day, condoning the massacres in Gaza. And as a result, friends of the Palestinians, and that includes, of course, many Muslims in Britain, but also many non-Muslims, we were obliged to take to the streets in what Suella Braverman, I hesitate to find the right adjective to describe that woman, but that nasty woman, spoke about the hate marches. The hate marches.
She's the former Home Secretary.
Home Secretary.
The Interior Minister for the UK.
And she and alongside many others, Michael Gove, and lots of others, stoked the fires of resentment against Muslims for having the temerity to take to the streets in extremely peaceful and extremely large marches opposed to British policy, which was supporting Israel. They were asking for trouble. And now, as I say, the chickens have come home to roost. They more or less goaded the pro-Palestinian camp to come out in numbers on the streets because we had no alternative. Parliament was failing us. There was no democratic choice in October. You could be with Israel, or you could have Israel's back, or you could be a die-hard supporter of Israel. But what you couldn't be was pro-Palestinian, not in terms of condemning what Israel was doing. And therefore people took to the streets. And of course, this raised the temperature, inflamed passions on all sides. And in no time, the right-wing media, aided and abetted by the pro-Labour media, they weren't far behind, were demonizing the marchers and demonizing Muslims.
Right. Peter, can I just stop you there and come in? So just to be clear, you're saying that to avoid the issue of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people, to avoid that deep criticism of those war crimes, you're saying that they tried to smear and to besmirch the pro-Palestine protests as some kind of like Islamic infection or infiltration of British society.
Exactly, Finian. Muslims were portrayed as a sort of fifth column, and there were so many people in. I had the misfortune to read on a regular basis the Daily Mail, because you must know your enemies, I believe, and they were stoking Islamophobia on a daily basis. And of course, the other branches of the right-wing media, GB News, of course, virtually 24 hours a day have been stoking the fires of Islamophobia. And all this because Muslims dared to oppose British foreign policy in the Middle East. And Labour were not standing up for them. In past years, Labour had been a little bit pro-Palestinian, but not only have Labour under Starmer ejected the pro-Palestinian former leader Corbyn, but they've gone through 180 degrees change, and they are now completely a tool of the pro-Israel lobby. And therefore, as was demonstrated at the February by-election in Rochdale, won by George Galloway, coming from absolutely nowhere to trounce the field. This was a referendum on British Middle East policy, specifically on Gaza policy, and it was a vote of protest against the conduct of British foreign policy, and it had the effect of further inflaming passions, and people started to talk about, oh, now the Muslims are marching politically, and this inflamed what was already a volatile situation because of the broader situation with migration and the boats. This was an added layer. I'm not saying foreign policy caused the whole thing, but it stoked the fires. It lit the blue touch paper, the British government reaction to Gaza, and it continues to this day.
Right, Peter. Let's talk about the issue of immigration later, but just keep that train of thought about the British media. The British state was trying to undermine the Gaza protesters, and there was massive weekly protests in London, all across the UK, 200,000, 300,000 people coming out every weekend, severely criticizing the British government's support for the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And to undermine that, they then tried to portray it as a sort of a Muslim mob or something like that. Now, how did that tie in with the terrible incident in Southport then over a week ago, when some youth stabbed to death 3 young girls, and it was a horrible incident? But how does that tie in with then the Islamophobia that you're talking about that was whipped up, and what's happened over the last week?
Yes, well, during the general election campaign, the Conservatives tried to whip up anti-Muslim sentiment. George Galloway called this out, in fact, the day after he had won Rochdale that first time in February. Sunak, you are trying to make Muslims the subject matter of the coming general election, and that is more or less what happened, because the two issues have got conflated, the Muslim question and the migration question. The most sensitive, in a way, aspect of the migrant question is the Muslim aspect. There are many thousands of Ukrainians coming. There are many thousands of Hong Kongers coming, but they barely rate on the radar of migration concern. But any Muslims coming, that's another question. So these two issues have got conflated. So logically, after the dreadful events of Southport, there should have been an anti-Rwandan pogrom or anti-Black African, but that didn't fit the narrative that people had already been primed for. People had been primed to assume that the perpetrator was a Muslim migrant. It didn't. The truth of what actually happened in Southport was incidental. People had been primed, and there were malign actors who wasted not one moment in taking advantage of it to spread false information, as we know.
Yeah.
The perpetrator had been a Muslim migrant.
Right. Initially, it was misreported that the attacker, a 17-year-old youth, was a Muslim, a recent asylum seeker from a Muslim country. Turns out the suspect was born in the UK in Cardiff, of African descent. So the misinformation, the mischaracterization of the attacker then was vented in widespread attacks on Muslim communities and mosques and Asian businesses and things like that. Anybody who's perceived to be of Islamic culture. Right. But what you're saying, Peter, that the background to this, with the whipping up of the Islamophobia to discredit the Gaza protesters, then fed into this, anger towards the we're seeing now in the past week.
Yes, it fed into the hysteria over migration, which has been going on for quite a number of years. There was plenty of tinder lying around for the conflagration, but it needed a match, and it needed people to strike the match. People like Farage and those, and the so-called or self-styled Tommy Robinson. But the ground had been prepared by mainstream politicians going on and on about immigration, a genuine concern, especially for working people, especially for those in already vulnerable communities, having many migrants billeted on them as they perceived it, a genuine concern. But the passions were whipped up further by malign actors seeking political advantage. And these malign actors had further spread tinder around by lying to the people, by raising false expectations of what Brexit would mean. Much of the Brexit election campaign was conducted in terms of stopping the boats, stopping migration. Farage in particular led people to believe that Brexit was the answer to the migration problem. And as we've seen, the reality has been the opposite. So, of course, people are frustrated because none of the politicians has an answer to their concerns. But perhaps we can go back further. You have to scroll back further. Why are there so many migrants? And again, foreign policy is there in the background. Foreign policy, it was foreign policy that caused us to invade Iraq. Many of the refugees and migrants have come from Iraq. Afghanistan, another war of choice. We didn't have to go into Afghanistan. We didn't have to hang around for 20 years in Afghanistan. More waves of migration. Syria, we didn't have to bomb Syria. We didn't have to try to destabilize Syria, provoking literally millions of refugees to flood all the way across Europe. We didn't have to put sanctions on Syria to make sure that Syria couldn't recover and reabsorb its population. We continue to stir up trouble, get involved in the Middle East. Now when we're just a hair's breadth away from a war with Iran. What would happen then if Iran was destabilized as a result? More migrants. And we provoked Russia, the Ukrainians, provoked China, the Hong Kongers. You know, you can say that all these actions had to be taken, they were the right thing or the wrong thing, but you can't say they didn't have an impact on migration. They did. That is why at Libya, I'm forgetting perhaps the most important one, because so many of the African migrants used Libya that we destabilized as a jumping off point for Europe. We did our damn best to destabilize all these countries, and these chickens are now coming home to roost.
Yeah. And Peter, to talk about the Workers' Party of Britain, your party that you're deputy leader of, I mean, what would you put forward as, you know, policies to I would say to address the problems of, you know, social decay, perceptions of mass migration? What would your party propose doing about that?
The main thrust of our policy is to stop these wars of choice, to stop destabilizing, particularly in the Middle East, to stop stoking tensions that lead to outflow, to help to re-stabilize countries like Libya and Syria so that migrants can actually go back. That would be the rational course, the sensible course. That's what we advocate. That's our main point about migration. In the meanwhile, there are all these awful, virtually insoluble problems for which we don't make false claims to have easy answers, unlike some of the other parties. They caused this problem. They caused this problem. They have to figure out the solutions. But in the meanwhile, working class communities are literally on the front lines, suffering, and in many cases caught up in the riots.
Well, as the title of your party suggests, the Workers' Party of Britain, I mean, you would espouse a very overt, very strong socialist policies of public ownership and massive public investment in communities to regenerate jobs and services.
Indeed, we are, if you like, old style Labour, the Labour Party as it was in the days of Tony Benn, when Labour really did stand for socialism and stood up for the working class. We're the only party that still talks in terms of class. We're not afraid to talk about class because basically there's no more left and right the way we see it. There's us and them. There's the elite and there's the working class. And we see this on the streets today. Many in the working class have been misled, literally misled by Pied Pipers like Tommy Robinson, used as cannon fodder for the malign right. And we in the Workers' Party are trying to use our voice to make people see that they're being exploited. And to give support to migrant communities.
Yeah, Peter, you don't hear people like the man you mentioned there, Tommy Robinson, or other people like Nick Griffin or Douglas Murray, who seems to be a little bit more erudite. He's a columnist for the Spectator. I saw him on some Sky News program giving his take on the whole riots of the last week. You never hear these people talking about these wars of choice and the absolute abomination of destroying countries by the British government with its American patron, and you never hear about that bigger picture where the immigration problems that they are very agitated about do, according to yourself and others, emanate from the destruction of countries decade after decade abroad. You never hear those kind of apologists, I would say, for these riots. These apologists, you never hear them making that connection as you're doing now, very eloquently, that this is chickens coming home to roost for years of war crimes and illegal wars abroad.
Exactly, and it's hardly surprising when the pro-Israel lobby is actively and blatantly behind people like Tommy Robinson. It's an open secret that he's accepted funding and been praised by pro-Israeli elements. He's a proud supporter of Israel. That tells you pretty much all you need to know, where much of his funding is coming from and why people of that ilk are not going to trace the roots of the problem back where it belongs, to British support for American policy in the Middle East, support for Israel, and a willingness to destabilize countries, even though we face the consequences.
So, Peter, on a if you could kind of try to quantify this contribution or this cause to the problems of migration and flows of people, you would say the wars of choice, the illegal criminal conduct of foreign policy by the British government in the Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, you would say that's, on a scale of 10, that's up there near 9 as far as the, if you could try to quantify its contribution to the whole tensions around migration.
Indeed, if we had not had these wars of choice, if we not had Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, Hong Kong, you take those out of the equation, and certainly the issue of illegal migrants would be reduced by 90%. Of course, there's illegal migration is only about 10% of the total migration inflow, and these we need, of course, the NHS is absolutely desperate to recruit foreign nurses, and it's most unfortunate these two strands of migration have got mixed up. But in terms of illegal migration, British foreign policy is the key driver. And we have it in our power quickly to dial back. We could drop sanctions on Syria tomorrow. We could stop ratcheting up our involvement in the Red Sea and bombing Yemen tomorrow. We could dial down the crisis with Iran tomorrow.
Yeah.
We should do.
Yeah. Peter Ford, we're going to leave it there because you've covered a lot in the few minutes I've had the pleasure and privilege of talking with you. I'd just like to remind anybody watching this video and you're listening to you that Peter Ford is a former ambassador to Bahrain and Syria before the regime war began in Syria, mind you. He was very critical of the UK launching of the war with the United States on Iraq in 2003. And since then, Peter Ford has gained a lot of respect for his integrity and his truth-telling and criticism of British foreign policy. And with your experience and insights of the Middle East and British foreign policy in that region, Peter, I think your take on the recent riots and tensions over migration are very needed to be listened to for the authority that you possess. So thank you very much, Peter, for giving us your insights and your expertise, your historical knowledge of British government policy. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for having me, Finian. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Peter. Cheerio now. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Yeah, I hope the recording works.
I hope so too, Peter.
If not, I don't mind trying Zoom again. But anyway,
okay,
see
Peter.
how it goes.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, bye-bye.